Rome once crowned a boy as emperor. He was only 14 years old, a teenager raised far from the marble temples and iron discipline of the Roman world. His name was Elagabalus, and when he arrived in the capital, he did not come as a conqueror or a statesman. He came as a priest, carrying with him a strange god from the deserts of the east. At first, the empire celebrated its young ruler. The soldiers believed they had restored the rightful blood of a fallen dynasty. The crowds expected another strong emperor to lead Rome into glory. But what they received instead was something they could not understand. The boy emperor began to change everything. Sacred traditions were broken. Forbidden marriages shocked the aristocracy. Strange rituals filled the streets with music, fire, and whispers of madness. Senators watched in horror as the ancient order of Rome began to bend beneath the will of a teenager who believed he could reshape the empire itself. But Rome is not easily remade, and the men who place a crown upon your head can also decide the moment you must die. This is the dark and astonishing story of Elagabalus, the boy emperor who tried to transform Rome and paid for it with his life. If you are fascinated by the darkest chapters of royal history, subscribe to the channel and step deeper into the shadows of power. Rome in the early 3rd century looked powerful from the outside. Its legions guarded thousands of miles of frontier. Its cities were filled with wealth, marble temples, and monuments to victory. To the world beyond its borders, Rome still appeared eternal. But inside the empire, something had begun to crack. Emperors no longer ruled for decades. They rose quickly, and they died quickly. Some were betrayed by their own guards. Others were murdered by rivals who wanted the purple cloak for themselves. Power in Rome had become a dangerous throne, one that could lift a man to the height of glory and destroy him just as easily. The army had become the true kingmaker. A commander with loyal soldiers could become emperor almost overnight. Loyalty was bought with gold, promises, and fear. And when loyalty faded, the emperor often disappeared with it. When the emperor Caracalla was suddenly killed during a campaign in the east, the empire entered another moment of uncertainty. Rome did not just lose a ruler. It lost the fragile balance that kept powerful factions from tearing the state apart. In times like this, the empire needed something simple, a symbol, a face that could calm the soldiers and reassure the provinces that Rome still had a master. Far from the capital, in the Syrian city of Emesa, there lived a boy who could become that symbol. He was not a general. He had never commanded an army or debated in the Senate. His world was temples, rituals, and the worship of an ancient sun god. Yet history has a strange way of choosing its rulers. In a moment of fear and ambition, powerful hands began to reach toward this quiet boy. They did not see a leader. They saw a throne that could be controlled, and an empire that needed someone to sit upon it. The future of the Roman Empire was about to be decided not on a battlefield, but in whispers. In the eastern provinces, the legions were restless. News of the death of Emperor Caracalla had spread quickly through the camps. For many soldiers, he had been a familiar figure, a leader whose name still carried weight among the ranks. Without him, the empire suddenly felt uncertain, and uncertainty was dangerous for Rome. Julia Maesa understood this better than anyone. She had once lived at the center of imperial power, and she knew that the loyalty of soldiers could shape the fate of the entire empire. If the army believed in a ruler, that ruler could claim the throne. If the army doubted him, even the strongest emperor could fall. So she began to build a story. Quietly, carefully, the rumor spread through the eastern legions. The young priest from her family, a boy known for serving in the temple of the sun god, was not simply a noble child from Syria. According to Maesa, he carried the blood of the dead emperor himself. The boy, she said, was the secret son of Caracalla. For soldiers who had once followed Caracalla into battle, the idea was powerful. Some questioned the claim. Others saw in the boy a resemblance that made the rumor feel real enough to believe. But belief needed encouragement. Gold moved through the camps. Officers received gifts. Soldiers were promised generous rewards if they supported the claim. In the Roman army, loyalty could often be guided by the sound of coins. Soon the moment arrived. The boy was presented before the soldiers wearing the imperial purple. Standards were raised. Voices began to shout his name. And in that moment, the 14-year-old priest was proclaimed emperor of the Roman world. When the new emperor finally approached Rome, the city waited with curiosity and unease. Rome had seen young rulers before, but this one came from far beyond the familiar world of Roman tradition. The boy who had been proclaimed emperor by the Eastern legions was still almost a stranger to the people he now ruled. His arrival did not look like the return of a Roman conqueror. There were no scars from battle, no hardened general standing at the head of victorious troops. Instead, the young emperor entered the city surrounded by attendants, musicians, and priests from the East. Their clothing, their language, even their rituals felt foreign to the eyes of Rome. The first thing people noticed was the emperor himself. Elagabalus did not dress like a Roman ruler. The emperors before him had worn the symbols of military authority, armor, cloaks, and the stern expression of command. But this boy appeared in flowing silk garments that shimmered in the sunlight. His face carried makeup that few Roman men would ever dare to wear. Rings and jeweled ornaments glittered on his hands and neck. Crowds gathered in the streets to watch him pass. At first, many stared in silence, unsure how to react. Others whispered among themselves, wondering what kind of emperor Rome had just received. But the most mysterious object of all followed closely behind him. Carefully transported across the empire was a black stone, smooth and ancient, carried in ceremonial procession by priests from Syria. To them, it was not simply a stone. It was the sacred embodiment of a powerful sun god worshipped in the city of Emesa. For Elagabalus, this god was the center of everything. The young emperor was not only a ruler, he was also the high priest of this deity. The stone had been brought to Rome for a purpose. It would be placed at the heart of the imperial capital, where the emperor intended to honor it with the same devotion he had shown since childhood. To many Romans, this was deeply unsettling. Rome had always welcomed foreign gods into its temples, but there had always been a clear order. Above all others stood Jupiter, the king of the Roman gods, protector of the empire and symbol of Roman power. Yet whispers soon spread through the city. The young emperor did not intend for this Eastern god to stand beside the Roman gods. He intended for it to stand above them. Rome had always believed that its strength came from order. The laws of the Republic and the Empire were not just rules, they were sacred traditions passed down for centuries. Every emperor before had understood that power in Rome depended on respecting those traditions, or at least pretending to. Elagabalus showed little interest in pretending. At first, the Senate hoped that the strange clothing and foreign rituals were simply the habits of a young ruler raised far from Rome. They expected that with time he would learn the customs of the empire. Instead, the opposite happened. The emperor began breaking traditions one after another, as if the old rules meant nothing to him. His first marriage ended almost as quickly as it began. Divorce itself was not shocking in Rome. Many powerful men had done the same, but what followed stunned the city. Elagabalus announced that he would marry a woman who had sworn one of the most sacred vows in Roman religion. She was a Vestal virgin. The Vestals were priestesses chosen as children to serve the goddess Vesta. Their duty was to protect the sacred flame of Rome, a fire believed to guard the destiny of the empire. In return, they lived under strict vows of purity. If a Vestal broke that vow, the punishment was death, buried alive beneath the earth. For centuries, no ruler had dared to challenge this law. Yet the emperor did exactly that. Elagabalus publicly married the Vestal priestess, claiming that the union had divine meaning. According to him, it symbolized a sacred marriage between his sun god and the goddess of Rome. To the people watching in shock, it looked less like religion and more like sacrilege. The outrage did not end there. Rumors began spreading through the capital that the emperor was forming relationships that Romans considered unthinkable for a ruler. Ancient writers later claimed that Elagabalus openly favored male partners and even held public ceremonies that looked like marriage. In the streets and marketplaces, people spoke more quietly now. The emperor still held absolute power, and criticizing him openly could be dangerous. But whispers travel easily in a crowded city, in the baths, in taverns, and in the halls of the Senate. The same word began to appear again and again in frightened conversations. Madness. The imperial palace on the Palatine Hill had always been a place of power. But under Elagabalus, it slowly transformed into something very different. What had once been the disciplined center of the Roman world began to resemble a stage for spectacle. Night after night, the palace filled with feasts. Tables stretched across great halls, covered with rare foods brought from every corner of the empire. Exotic fruits from distant provinces, wines aged for decades, spices carried along dangerous trade routes. Servants moved constantly between the guests, carrying silver trays heavy with delicacies. Music echoed through the chambers long after midnight. Dancers, musicians, and performers from the east entertained the emperor and his companions. Many of the guests were young favorites chosen by Elagabalus himself. The atmosphere inside the palace was one of constant celebration, as if the empire had entered an endless festival. But the celebrations were only one part of the strange new court. Elagabalus filled the palace with priests devoted to his Syrian sun god. Sacred ceremonies were held frequently, sometimes lasting for hours. The black stone that symbolized the god was treated as the true center of imperial authority. Processions carried it through Rome in elaborate displays, while the emperor himself led the rituals dressed in colorful priestly garments. To some Romans, the ceremonies looked less like religion and more like theater. Meanwhile, the cost of these displays grew larger with every passing month. Gold flowed out of the imperial treasury to support the palace, the feasts, the ceremonies, and the growing circle of favorites who surrounded the young ruler. Beyond the palace walls, the empire still faced its usual problems. Governors struggled to manage distant provinces. Soldiers guarded the frontiers against restless enemies. Officials tried to maintain order across a vast territory that stretched from Britain to the deserts of the east. But inside the palace, the emperor seemed far removed from those concerns. Many senators began to feel uneasy. Rome had tolerated strange rulers before, but there was always an unspoken rule. An emperor could indulge in luxury, but he still had to appear in control of the empire. Elagabalus rarely showed interest in that responsibility. The contrast became impossible to ignore. While the ruler of Rome devoted his days to ritual and pleasure, frustration was quietly building across the city. And patience, even in Rome, was never endless. Power in Rome rarely collapsed in a single dramatic moment. More often, it eroded slowly, quietly, through fear and calculation behind closed doors. By the fourth year of Elagabalus' rule, the atmosphere around the emperor had changed. The Senate no longer tried to hide its contempt. Many senators felt humiliated by the strange rituals forced upon the city, and by the emperor's complete disregard for Roman tradition. Publicly, they still bowed and spoke the language of loyalty, but in private, their patience was gone. Among the soldiers, the mood was no better. The Praetorian Guard had once supported the young ruler because they believed he was the rightful heir of the previous emperor. But the rumors and scandals surrounding him had spread through the barracks. Soldiers whispered that the emperor behaved more like a priest of foreign gods than the leader of Rome. Discipline began to weaken. Respect slowly disappeared. Elagabalus either did not notice or chose to ignore the danger. Inside the palace, he continued to surround himself with entertainers, priests, and loyal favorites who told him what he wanted to hear. The world outside those marble walls seemed distant and unimportant. But one person was watching very carefully. Julia Maesa. She was the woman who had engineered the rise of her grandson. Years earlier, she had spread the story that convinced the Eastern legions to support him. She had financed the rebellion with her immense fortune. Without her ambition, the boy from Emesa would have remained an unknown temple priest. Now she saw something deeply troubling. The emperor she had created was becoming impossible to control. Every scandal weakened his position. Every broken tradition angered another powerful group inside Rome. Maesa understood the brutal logic of Roman politics better than almost anyone alive. A ruler who loses the support of the army does not remain ruler for long. Quietly, she began to consider another option. There was another grandson, a boy younger than Elagabalus, calmer, more disciplined, someone who might restore order and win back the trust of the soldiers. His name was Alexander. At first, the idea moved only through whispered conversations inside private rooms of the palace. Loyal supporters were approached carefully. Allies inside the Praetorian Guard were observed and measured. The conspiracy did not begin with raised swords. It began with a realization shared by a few powerful people. The emperor they had created could no longer protect their future. And if Rome was to survive the storm gathering around the palace, someone else would have to wear the crown. The tension that had been building in Rome finally reached a breaking point in the year 222. For months, the relationship between the emperor and the Praetorian Guard had grown fragile. The soldiers who once protected him now watched him with growing doubt. Their loyalty was no longer certain, and rumors inside the barracks spread faster each day. At the center of those rumors stood another name, Alexander Severus. Encouraged by his grandmother, Julia Maesa, Elagabalus had reluctantly adopted his younger cousin as his heir months earlier. At the time, it seemed like a clever political move. The soldiers admired the calm and disciplined young Alexander, and naming him as successor helped ease their anger. But what began as a compromise slowly turned into something far more dangerous. The guards began comparing the two young men. One was known for spectacle, scandal, and strange ceremonies. The other appeared quiet, respectful, and more in line with Roman expectations. In the eyes of many soldiers, the choice began to look obvious. Inside the palace, Elagabalus soon sensed the shift. Reports reached him that the Praetorians were showing more loyalty to Alexander than to the emperor himself. Fear and suspicion started growing in his mind. He attempted to remove his cousin from power. The plan failed. Instead, the tension exploded into open crisis. Determined to confront the situation directly, Elagabalus decided to visit the Praetorian camp. He believed that his presence as emperor would restore discipline. After all, the guard had sworn loyalty to him. When he arrived, something immediately felt wrong. The soldiers were gathered in large numbers, but the atmosphere was cold and silent. Their faces showed no enthusiasm, no excitement at the arrival of the ruler they were meant to protect. Then the emperor saw the truth. Standing among the soldiers, surrounded by men who greeted him with respect, was Alexander Severus. The guard had already made its decision. They no longer looked at Elagabalus as their ruler. Their loyalty had quietly shifted to the young cousin who stood calmly among them. In that moment, the emperor understood something terrifying. He was no longer the most powerful man in Rome. He was simply a ruler whose protectors had chosen someone else. The silence inside the Praetorian camp did not last long. A shout suddenly cut through the courtyard, then another. Within seconds, the tension that had filled the air exploded into chaos. Soldiers rushed forward. The small group of attendants around the emperor tried to hold their ground, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. The Praetorian Guard moved with brutal certainty. These were the same men who had once sworn to protect the ruler of Rome. Now they were hunting him. Elagabalus understood the danger instantly. He turned and ran. The young emperor rushed through the stone corridors of the barracks, panic replacing the confidence he had carried into the camp only moments earlier. Behind him, he could hear the thunder of boots and the shouts of soldiers spreading through the compound. Beside him ran his mother, Julia Soaemias, struggling to keep pace as fear overtook them both. They searched desperately for an escape. But the Praetorian camp was a fortress. Gates were guarded, passages were blocked, and soldiers were pouring in from every direction. The emperor, who once commanded the Roman world, now found himself trapped inside the stronghold of his own guards. The emperor and his mother rushed through the narrow corridors of the barracks, their footsteps echoing against the stone walls. Panic spread quickly among the few servants and attendants who had followed them into the camp. Some tried to block the soldiers behind them, others simply scattered in fear. But there was no safe path left. The Praetorian Guard knew every corner of the fortress. They poured into the hallways from every direction, cutting off every possible escape. The sounds of shouting and armored footsteps grew louder with each passing moment. Elagabalus had once commanded the most powerful empire in the world. Now he was simply a frightened boy running for his life. The emperor and his mother remained inside a small chamber deep within the barracks. For a brief moment, the noise outside seemed distant. The young ruler, who had spent years surrounded by luxury and ceremony, now faced the terrifying reality of abandonment. No loyal army was coming. No senator would intervene. The soldiers who once guarded his throne were now hunting him. The doors were forced open. Praetorian soldiers flooded into the room with weapons drawn. What followed was swift and merciless. The fury that had been building among the guards finally erupted inside those stone walls. Elagabalus was only 18 years old. His reign had lasted 4 years, filled with strange ceremonies, broken traditions, and endless controversy that had shocked the Roman world. For many of the soldiers, this moment felt less like murder and more like the violent correction of a ruler they believed had shamed the empire. When it was over, the anger of the guards had not faded. The bodies of the emperor and his mother were dragged through the streets of Rome. Crowds gathered in stunned silence as the fallen ruler was pulled across the same city that had once been forced to celebrate his rise to power. At last, his body was thrown into the dark waters of the Tiber River. No royal funeral, no monument. Only the river carrying away the memory of a boy Emperor Rome wished to forget. If you enjoy discovering the dark and dramatic stories hidden in history, subscribe to the channel and continue exploring the shadows of the ancient world with us.